Hello, I'm Richard Seltzer. I'd like to share with you a romantic story from my book, To Gether Tales, which will soon be published by All Things That Matter Press. In the book, the narrator, in the midst of the pandemic, thinks back to a 7-day Caribbean cruise he was on a few years before, on which 8 people shared a dinner table and swapped stories every night. The narrator laments that with social distancing and mask wearing, love at first sight may no longer be possible. Imagine that you are on that cruise and the story is told by someone sitting across from you at the dinner table. Carpe diem is what I say, noted the lady sitting to Adolph's right. And you are, madam? Thelma. We're Thelma and Stan. I always say, like the ice cream shop at our local mall, life's short, eat dessert first. I have a koi, a carp, a Japanese goldfish. I've had him for 60 years and he's 2.5 feet long. I call him Carpe Diem. He's my reminder, not a memento mori, a reminder of death, rather a memento vivendi, a reminder that it's time to live, and it's always time to live. A wise woman, noted Adolf. A woman after my own heart. Thelma was rosy-cheeked and of generous proportions. Dieting would be contrary to her self-indulgent style of life. The extra flesh on her face erased what in a thinner woman would be wrinkles. She dressed to draw attention to her fulsome bust. At over 80, she had a youthful glow and an unabashed manner of speech. Her husband's evident delight at her looks and style amplified her aura of mature sexuality. She frequently stroked his thigh or kissed the lobe of his ear, telegraphing to him and to all around that she was ready to pleasure him as soon as dinner was done. They were the same height, about 5'6", but she was about 50 pounds heavier than he. They could have dressed up as Laurel and Hardy, with him as Stan Laurel. That made it easy to remember his name was Stan, and her name was easy to remember as well. No one else at the table was old enough to be named Thelma. We're newlyweds, she announced proudly. I'm his first. He's my 8th. We were going to enter the newlywed game tomorrow. We've got our answers figured out and rehearsed. How does that work? Asked Adolf. The MC asks the husbands questions with the wives out of the room. Then he brings in the wives and asks them the same questions. If you give the same answers as your spouse, you win. And what, may I ask, are your answers and the questions thereunto? They always ask, when did you do it last? To that we'll answer, this morning. Then they ask, what's the most unusual place you've done it? To that we'll say, on the balcony. That will get the audience laughing. We're shoo-in. You tell it like it is, Adolf chuckled. I'm no Sunday school teacher, that's for sure. You sound like my ex. You're divorced? Never married. She died 3 months ago. May, I called her. You don't resemble her physically, but your style reminds me of her. I'm honored by the comparison, but sorry for your loss. 3 months ago, Adolf repeated, turning solemn and serious. After 30 years of almost married bliss, she was May Estes, May East, not West, and never the Mark Twain shall meet. But enough of me, he smiled again. How did you newlyweds meet? Through match, said Thelma. No, Stan interrupted, taking her hand and giving it a squeeze. We met at the funeral of her last husband. And why did Thelma say match? Asked Adolf. We don't usually talk about this with strangers. It's easy to say match and people just accept that without questions. Thelma's embarrassed that we met at her last husband's funeral. She thinks that sounds unseemly. I think it's romantic. I was at the funeral home for the wake of a friend of mine when I saw her across the hall at another wake. Randomly, we made eye contact. I wandered over and waited in the reception line. When I shook her hand, I could feel the sparks, the special chemistry between us. I slipped in beside her to talk to her and shook hands with everybody who came by, like she did. Everybody assumed I was a member of the family. That night I wrote a story inspired by her, a pornographic story. I gave it to her the next day at the funeral when I was standing close to her. It rained. I had an umbrella and shared it with her. I drove her home. She told me that reading that story while sitting beside me in the car gave her an orgasm. We've been together ever since. Well, Thelma, what about the rest? Asked Adolf. What about the 7 other men who've shared your life in your bed? I married young, fresh out of high school. I got a job as a caregiver for an old man. He didn't think he needed help, but his kids insisted and paid. He was a widower. He'd been married for 60 years. He had married his high school sweetheart and never touched another woman. I liked the man. I wanted to make him happy. So over time, I got touchy-feely with him. We had our playful routines. I made good use of my hands and then my mouth as well. He enjoyed it. I could make him happy with so little, and it was great fun to give him pleasure that he had never imagined he would feel again. But nothing would get a proper rise out of him. You know what I mean. Then I tried role play, making up stories to go with our caressing and cuddling. Once in fantasy, I suggested that we get married. That was our first wooden moment, but it didn't last. It didn't stay up for long. He said that was because he couldn't delude himself into believing that it was real. Fantasy wasn't enough for him. I really liked the guy. Aside from the inaction of his equipment, he turned me on. I figured, what the hell? I married him. It was a private ceremony at his house. His kids hated me. They thought I was a predator, swooping in to marry the old guy for his money. I insisted over his protest that we do a prenup, and he'd draw up a new will with his kids as the only beneficiaries. Everything would go to his 6 kids and nothing to me. On the night of our wedding, he was ready, oh so ready. We went on a honeymoon cruise, the first cruise for both of us, and we rarely left our cabin. We did it 3 times a day on the slowest days. Our record was 12, and we stopped counting. I was 19 then. Now I'm over 80. And no, I won't tell you how much over 80. When my first husband died, I married another 80-year-old. And then again and again. Each husband lasted 5 to 10 years, happy years, except for one marriage that lasted 14 and wasn't happy at all. I finally divorced that one, my only divorce. He's still kicking now at 103. From what I hear, he's playing Viagra games at the village. Stan here is an 80-year-old like the others. In my book, that's prime time, aged to perfection. Only this time my husband is younger than I am. I'm the older woman. She smiled and gave him a kiss. Stan added, I was a judge for 25 years, but the best judgment I ever made was marrying this fine lady. You're my sweetheart, she replied, kissing him again, this time overtly inserting her tongue in his mouth. I hope you enjoyed that story. It comes from To Gether Tales, a novel of mine that will soon be published by All Things That Matter Press. My name is Richard Seltzer, as in Alka-Seltzer. My email is seltzer@seltzerbooks.com. All Things That Matter Press recently published 3 other novels of mine, Parallel Lives, Beyond the Fourth Door, and Nevermind. You can find those all at Amazon as paperbacks and as ebooks. They can be read in any order. They're independent stories with overlapping theme and styles. Each presents a different view of reality, a different way of trying to make sense of the mysteries of life.